Oh,
Okay.
And actually, I want to show a couple of slides. Can I do that, or do you need to make me a co-host?
You are a co-host, so feel free
Oh,
to
am
do
I
it.
already? Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
A very warm good evening and welcome to everyone present here. It is often said that the end of the story is the beginning of many others. The valedictory address by Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty that concludes the two-day online international conference titled Globalization and Terrains of Consciousness, Phenomenologies of the Global, Local, Global, promises to present us with new beginnings and spring intriguing ideas. Without further ado, I would like to introduce and invite Professor Simi Malhotra to chair the session. Simi Malhotra is professor at the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, Delhi. Her research interests include contemporary literary and cultural theory, cultural studies, and heterodox Indian philosophies, theology, and aesthetic practices, particularly Sikhism. Her latest publications are the edited books Food Culture Studies in India, Consumption, Representation, and Mediation, and Inhabiting Cyberspace in India, Theory, Perspectives, and Challenges, both from Springer 2021. She's the recipient of several grants and awards, the latest being the 2020 Duo India Professor Fellowship Award. Over to you, ma'am.
thank you so much, Sakshi. And before I ask Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty for starting, I have an announcement to make, and which is from Professor Arjun Appadurai. Professor Dipesh, of course, knows about it. Professor Appadurai wanted to be part of the valedictory, but unfortunately, because of some situation, he can't be part of it. And he sent his apologies, of course, to Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty and to all of us too. And so, of course, we miss him. But as I promised to him, we will be sharing the recording of the lecture with him. And of course, he's promised to see all the other recordings of the other lectures on YouTube as well. So now I formally welcome all of you to the valedictory session of the conference. And it is my proud privilege and honor to introduce the speaker of the session, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, though he actually needs no introduction. And in his case, of course, it's not really a cliche. It would not be far from the truth to claim that Professor Chakrabarty's writings have influenced us all in the humanities and social sciences, and it is near impossible to escape the sheer force of his ideas and his works. So I take on this onerous task of encapsulating the academic journey of one of the tallest intellectuals of our times, and I'm aware that I will perhaps fail miserably in introducing to you all the monumental contribution that Professor Chakrabarty has made. Many of you will already know this, but let me introduce him. Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty did his BSc in Physics Honours from Presidency College, Calcutta, his MBA from IIM Calcutta, and finally his PhD in History from the Australian National University in Canberra. He is currently the Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor in History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations, and the College at the University of Chicago. He's also the Faculty Director, University of Chicago Center in Delhi, a Faculty Fellow of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, as also an Associate of the Department of English, and by courtesy, a faculty member in the Law School of the University of Chicago. Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty is a founding member of the Editorial Collective of Subaltern Studies, a consulting editor of Critical Inquiry, a founding editor of Postcolonial Studies, and has served on the editorial boards of the American Historical Review and Public Culture. He was one of the founding editors with Sheldon Pollock from Columbia and Sanjay Subramaniam from UCLA of the series South Asia Across the Disciplines, published by a consortium of 3 presses, Chicago, Columbia, and California. He served on the board of experts for non-Western art for the Humboldt Forum in Berlin and was a member of the scientific advisory board to the Center for Global Cooperation Research, Bonn and Hessen, for a few years from 2012. He's also an associate in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Technology, Sydney. Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty is the recipient of the 2014 Toynbee Foundation Prize for his contributions to global history and of the 2019 Tagore Memorial Prize, which is awarded by the government of West Bengal for his book, The Crises of Civilization. He was awarded a D.Litt honoris causa by the University of London in 2010 and an honorary doctorate by the University of Antwerp in 2011. He was elected an honorary fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2006 and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2004. Professor Chakrabarty has been a visiting professor, visiting scholar, and visiting fellow at numerous universities such as JNU and CSSS Calcutta in India, École Normale Supérieure Paris, the Max Planck Institute for Historical Sciences Göttingen, the Rachel Carson Center at Ludwig Maximilians University Munich, the University of Leiden, the University of Barcelona, and the European Union Humanities University Vilnius, Lithuania, all of these in Europe. He's also been at the University of Manchester, UK, Queen's University, Canada, the Australian National University, Canberra, and the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia, all in the Commonwealth. And the Humanities Institute at Princeton, the University of California, Berkeley, the University of California, Irvine, the State University of New York, Stony Brook, the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, the University of South Carolina History Center, the University of Washington, Seattle, the University of Iowa, the Institute of Advanced Study, University of Minnesota, the Pratt Institute, New York, all in the USA. Besides, of course, he's delivered special lectures and keynote addresses in universities all across the world, and I possibly cannot summarize those for you. Professor Chakrabarty's most recent book is The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, which is to be published from the University of Chicago, and as I understand, it will be out probably next month. Other recent books include The Crisis of Civilization, Exploring Global and Planetary History from OUP in 2018, and with Ronojit Dasgupta, Some Aspects of Labor History of Bengal in the 19th Century, Two Views from OUP in 2018. He's also the co-editor, along with Henning Trooper and Sanjay Subramaniam, of Historical Teleologies in the Modern World from Bloomsbury in 2015. His other publications include Rethinking Working Class History, Bengal, 1890 to 1940 from Princeton in 1989, Provincializing Europe, Postcolonial Thought and Historical Difference from Princeton in 2000, Habitations of Modernity, Essays in the Wake of Subaltern Studies from Chicago in 2002, and The Calling of History, Sajjodunath Sarkar and His Empire of Truth, 1900 to 1950 from Chicago in 2015. He has also edited with Shahid Amin, Subaltern Studies 9, with Carol Breckenridge, Homi Bhabha, and Sheldon Pollock, Cosmopolitanism, with Rochana Majumdar and Andrew Sartori, From the Colonial to the Post-Colonial, India and Pakistan in Transition, and with Bain Atwood and Claudio Lomnitz, The Public Life of History, a special issue of Public Culture. Professor Chakrabarty also writes regularly in Bengali. A collection of his essays written originally in Bengali was brought out in Calcutta. Itihasher Jonojibon or Ononno Prabandhu, The Public Life of History and Other Essays in 2011. Professor Chakrabarty is also a regular contributor to many Bengali newspapers and journals. Professor Chakrabarty, we are extremely grateful to you for taking out time to be with us this evening and for agreeing to deliver this valedictory address today. There could not have been a better culmination to our conference than to hear you speak. And friends, Professor Chakrabarty today shall be speaking to us on the global and the planetary, some thoughts on our times. Over to you, Professor Chakrabarty. Such an honor.
Simi, thank you very, very much for that very warm and, may I say, humbling introduction. It's a great honor to be at the conference, and I'm absolutely impressed by people's capacity to sustain a conference like this, intense, new, exciting, but over 3 days. That's an amazing feat. But it's also wonderful to have this opportunity to speak to you. And as I was just saying that Francesca's talk, at least I got the tail end of it, I thought really made my way much easier in terms of introducing the topic, because the conference was already talking about planets and planetarity and planetary thinking. So, so thank you very much, you and your co-organizers and everybody, for having me here. So I mean, you must all be exhausted, so I'll try to be as easy as possible on your nerves and senses, and I'll just turn the let me see, I'll turn the timer on so that I don't exceed my 45 minutes. So I'll stop wherever I am at in 45 minutes and then take questions. Hopefully some things will become clear, even if others aren't. But let me say this, I've been working off and on climate change and its implications for the humanities for the last 10 years. And somewhere into the work, I realized that even if we we're talking about using the word globe to talk about globalization and about global warming. I realized that, and it came out of a conversation with this French philosopher Catherine Malabou, that the globe in globalization, the word globe in globalization, meant something different from the word globe in global warming. And as I explored those differences, really I made it into a distinction between what I call the globe and the planet. And so the planet for me is pretty much what Earth system scientists describe as the Earth system. So this understanding that we live on a sphere in which geological and biological processes are connected. You can't separate geology from biology, which was one separation that I initially made when I took my first step writing an article on 4 thesis in 2009. But interestingly, I realized that we live on a planet where geology and biology and even life and non-life are connected, as Francisco was saying. I mean, the Earth simply has more minerals because it has oxygen. It has oxygen in the air because it has life. And so metals get oxidized. So life makes the planet more mineral rich. And we, of course, make use of those minerals through mining companies and our knowledge of geology. So the fact that it's been decades, it's taken decades for the scientists to get to this point that the Earth behaves like a system, and they use it in the singular. And it was it was in 1983 that the NASA first set up their subcommittee on Earth system science. It's an interdisciplinary science brought people together. So it's really as recently as 1963, or as late in the 20th century as 1963. 1983 is when they set it up. Whereas the globe I think of as what humans have made of this sphere by connecting it technologically with communications technology, other kinds of technology, made it into a sphere that we now live on, negotiate, travel from one part of the world to another. And one could say that its beginnings go back to European empires, and I think one can broadly follow Carl Schmitt's Nomos of the Earth in saying that it's really when the Europeans built ships, and the Dutch took the leadership in this. But of course, the Portuguese and the Spanish were also making them ships that could actually cross the deep seas. The sea was mostly coastal for human beings. Whereas, human crossed land only when the sea level went down and there was more land between continents that they could hop over, right? So, it began there, and today I would say even the Zoom platform we're on is almost a culmination of that process of globe making, because it produces its own sense of time-space compression, right? I mean, the Zoom itself produces a peculiar time where my morning merges with your evening. My satiated stomach after my breakfast kind of speaks to your hungry stomach waiting for your dinner. It's a peculiar time to share, but that's what globalization is. And I would say that the globe is also what the Earth would look like if you could go into space to your plain eyes. So the blue marble picture, 1972, of the Earth looking like a blue marble. So it's oneness to the sphere. Those I regard as part of the narrative of the globe. And the most significant thing about the globe is that the globe is the main protagonist of the story of globalization are humans. So it could be a story about capitalism, it could be a story about human inequalities, it could be a story about human suffering, what rich nations do to poor nations, all of those things. But you can't tell the story of globalization taking humans away from its center. The planet, on the other hand, decenters humans, because the planet is really speaks of the arrangement of life. And if you think about the atmosphere we breathe, and it's so essential to our breathing, and not just to our breathing, to plants, to other kinds of animals. The fact that the COVID virus can affect our lungs is because we are creatures with lungs, and creatures with lungs evolved because of the atmosphere that they had to breathe, right? So, so this atmosphere has maintained oxygen Now it's 21%. It's gone up and down, but it's been maintained at a level which made sure that the forest did not go up all in flames. So if there was too much oxygen, everything would catch fire. Or that it wasn't so low that animals would choke to death. So paleoclimatologists or geologists call this the modern atmosphere of the planet. And the modern atmosphere of the planet, which we critically depend on, is almost 400 million years old. And the interesting thing is that maintaining oxygen is an everyday business, because oxygen is a highly reactive gas. So if you put oxygen in the air, it will immediately mix up with other gases and things. So which means if you want to maintain oxygen, you have to keep supplying the air with oxygen. If you didn't supply the oxygen, humans would die. So who supplies the oxygen? Planktons, plants, right? Fungi, all kinds of bacteria, all kinds of forms of life that we consider to be inferior forms of life, basically run the atmosphere. If they didn't run the atmosphere and maintain it in its current state, we wouldn't exist. So you can see that the atmosphere was not made with us in mind, even though we critically depend on it. So in that sense, when you tell the story of the planet, humans get decentered, and that's why one of the major attractions I had in working on this topic was the attraction I felt for one of my old loves, which was geology, and one of my new loves is biology, because particularly evolutionary biology, because you can't tell the story of either geology or evolutionary biology without decentering humans, because humans come so late. And like Francisco said, we are like the apples on the apple tree. So humans come so late in the story that they can't be central to the story of the planet. And something that follows from that is that the globe is, you could say, is constitutionally political. Because the globe is made by humans, it's made by inequalities, it's made by empires, it's made by oppression, it's made by stealing and robbing indigenous peoples of their lands, all of those things. The planet, on the other hand, has existed, and the planet always, when the planet is furious, it reduces us to our creaturely lives, in the sense that our politics then becomes the politics of survival. And the politics of survival is not really the politics that humans aim for. Because politics is about moral management of society, right? So, and my most recent example of that is the Australian firestorms of 2019-20, right? Earlier last year. When you remember that Australian government actually took a decision to kill, that is, feral camels in the deserts in Australia. And these were camels taken from India and other places in the 19th century when they didn't have trains. So the camels, in fact, the train that goes from Adelaide to Darwin is still called the Ghan Express. Ghan being a corruption of Khan, right? Afghans, well, everybody is called Afghan, and they were all known as Khans. So the Ghan Express actually still bears the memory of the camel trains that used to, but now all those camels have gone feral. But the reason the government decided they would kill as many as 10,000 camels was because the camels were competing with a certain group of humans for water. So, it was a question of either the camels would survive or the humans would survive. So what I'm saying is, when you are faced with the planet's fury, then we are like any other creature trying to survive. So in that sense, the planet has the capacity to reduce us to our creatureliness. So not only does it decenter us, but it can actually reduce us to our creatureliness. Interestingly, the history of the science that became Earth system science, of course, it goes back to before the war, to interest in systems theory and cybernetics that was developing both in the United States and in the Soviet Union. But the more interesting part of it is that during the Second World War, all of these parties were considering and thinking actively about whether or not weather could be weaponized. Could you use weather to create floods in your enemy's territory? Could you create droughts in your enemy's territories? So the very interest in weaponizing weather made climate and weather a subject of political interest. And the fact that nuclear bombs were being exploded and tested and tried, after Nagasaki, Hiroshima, also made the atmosphere a matter of political interest. Because there were people who were measuring the fallout, radiation, and what would happen to the radiation. So for that reason, the atmosphere became a subject of political interest to the American president. And every year, he would actually convene a group of scientists to advise them on the state of the atmosphere. And it was actually in one of those meetings that an oceanographer, Roger Revelle, around 1958, I think he said, it got published eventually in a geology journal, the paper. He said that human beings are carrying out a grand experiment by releasing so quickly into the atmosphere the greenhouse gases that were stored in fossil fuel, in potential fossil, in fossil fuel, and that had taken the Earth hundreds of millions of years to create. So it was like somebody had taken a long time to build up a bank balance, and you were drawing it down very fast. And you were drawing it down at a rate that the atmosphere, or the system that the planet had for recycling carbon, couldn't cope with. So when we speak of there being excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what we mean is that it's in excess in relationship to the time it normally takes for the carbon sinks of the world to absorb that carbon. So in other words, if humans were not here and there was all this carbon in the atmosphere, the Earth would take its time to absorb it. It might take 10,000 years. A carbon cycle is also 100,000 years. It might take 100,000 years to absorb it. But because it's causing problems for us, so we define it as excess, and we would love the planet to, it's like sitting in a cycle or hand-pulled rickshaw in Calcutta and saying, "Jaldi chalo, hurry up." So we're trying to say to the planet, hurry up, you can't be so slow, because we want to put out all these gases in the atmosphere. Please absorb it. But it's in excess in human terms. So one of the interesting things I often say to students and friends is that the distinction between human time and the time of the planet has already entered our vocabulary without us always being aware of the distinction. So, when we make a distinction between renewable fuels and non-renewable fuels. So we think of fossil fuel as non-renewable, we think of solar as renewable, or the wind as renewable. But fossil fuels are actually perfectly renewable if you could hang around for 300 million years. So if our lifetime was coextensive with the planetary time, then we wouldn't have a problem, right? They're not renewable on our lifetime, on our scale of time. So there's already a kind of very interesting distinction between human time scale and the planetary time scale that has entered our vocabulary even without our being aware of it, right? Through this renewable, non-renewable distinction. So the more I worked on it, this distinction to me seemed absolutely important in understanding the predicament. But then there's a history. So as I said, so this interest in atmosphere led also, and that got coupled with the interest in space. So the other thing, part of the Cold War, was the interest in mastery of space, right? And Carl Sagan's unit in NASA, Francisco was talking about NASA, was tasked with this idea of imagining and finding out if Mars was habitable by human beings. Again, Francisco was talking about human beings colonizing Mars, becoming another species, and they would eventually evolve to be another species if they did go. But early days, and that's when between 1960 and 61, this British scientist, almost self-taught instrument maker, chemist James Lovelock came to work with Carl Sagan's unit, and eventually also worked with Lynn Margulis, Carl Sagan's ex-wife. Wife, and later they divorced. But and this question came up for the unit, if Mars was habitable. And I still remember growing up in India with an old Time magazine cover, which was American artist conception of what Mars would look like if humans colonized it. And you can go back and check that cover. Mars looked like Manhattan. I mean, the only thing that Americans could imagine was huge skyscrapers going up on Mars and polluting it in the same way as we do this planet. But And those, it was fascinating because they actually gave rise to a very big question, which was a question about what makes a planet habitable, friendly to life. And this life question was not being asked by biologists. In fact, it came out of science and more physics and thermodynamics, because the physicist Schrödinger had actually given a series of lectures in Dublin in 1939, which got published in a book called What is Life? And he basically had a thermodynamic understanding of what life was in terms of entropy, in terms of like food being the constant extra energy you have to supply to your body to prevent it from being taken over by its own entropy. So if you didn't eat, your body would just, as you know, unbecome. And so at that point, Lovelock, in one of the discussions, from his understanding, he said, look, don't worry about making it habitable for men or for humans. Make Mars habitable for bacteria first, and they'll do the job. Well, that's the story of life on this planet, right? So it's really these very inferior forms, so-called inferior forms of life, who manage life. I mean, we are really far from managing it. We are basically big sort of messers up of the arrangement. So it's really looking at Mars and the question of colonizing Mars that gave rise to this question of what is now called the habitability problem. What makes a planet habitable? And the other interesting man in this story who comes after Lovelock is a man called James Hansen, who was, when he was working on this, he was the head of the Goddard Space Center of NASA. And he was actually a specialist of Venus. And there was already this question why Venus was so hot, Mars was so cold, and why Earth was just right for life. And it was known that Venus had a runaway kind of planetary warming, and the atmosphere was full of carbon dioxide. So James Hansen actually wondered if the same thing was happening on Earth, because he knew about fossil fuels, he knew about motor cars, he knew that we were spewing out more CO2s. So he took 3 months leave from his research on Venus to work on this planet and found out that this indeed was happening. Ever since, he's been the main spokesperson, the godfather of Earth system science in the US. And he actually spoke to the US Congress, I think it was the Senate, perhaps, if I remember right, in 1988 about this problem. But just a few years before 1988, remember there was already this talk about there being a hole in the ozone layer. I mean, I was then in Australia, and sort of everybody was putting on, sunscreen and things because the UV rays and other things were coming in. Now, that had led to, you will remember, that had led to what's called the Montreal Protocol of the United Nations being used for fix that problem, and people fixed it technologically that by changing the propellant in spray cans, right? Hansen broke the news of global warming in 1988 to the US government. If you think about it, humanists were not taking any notice. We didn't know, even though it was becoming news. I was one of the first persons, I might say with humility and without being immodest, one of the first persons in the humanities to respond to the climate problem. And my first essay came out, my first essay came out in Bangla originally in 2008 and then in English in 2009. But this was decades after this had become news. Whereas if you look at what's happening in the humanities, what's happening is 1978, Edward Said publishes his Orientalism. In 1982, Benedict Anderson publishes Imagined Communities. 1983, Subaltern Studies comes out. Ranajit Guha publishes Elementary Aspects. 1986, Gayatri's modern version, she had a version before, of Can the Subaltern Speak comes out, right? 1986 is also when Partho's Nationalist Thought book comes out. Then 1994, Homi's The Location of Culture comes out. I think Arjun's Modernity at Large is pretty 1996, right? And My Provincialism in Europe, 2000. So actually, we were busy discussing making the humanities into weapons of the weak and discussing problems of inequality, distribution, but assuming that resource was not a problem. Assuming that inequality was the problem, distribution was the problem, and there were problems, there still are problems, I'm not denying that. But the message about global warming didn't percolate to people who were talking about globalization, right, and politics of globalization. And so if you, I mean, another symptom of the same problem is that in the American Historical Review in 2000, in the final issue perhaps, carried an article by a very well-known erudite Harvard historian called Charles Meyer. And the essay was called Consigning the 20th Century to History. And if you read the essay, it's got everything, the two wars, the Holocaust, the decolonization waves, everything there, not a word about global warming. So the point I'm making is that humanists were laggards. You know, our basic instinct was to ask, was not to do what Francesca was saying, that we are a species alongside being other things. For us, any talk about the species, any talk about one world, any talk that we're in it together was anathema, and basically looked like a ruse of either powerful nations or powerful people or powerful groups to hoodwink us into making us pay the price of their bad deeds. So when James Hansen broke the news, soon thereafter, within a year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, was set up by the UN. And then there was the Rio Conference. And in the Rio Conference, the first Indian intervention, very significant one, on the whole question of global warming took place and was made by Sunita Narayan, who is still alive, Center for Science and Environment, and Anil Agarwal, who is also another founder, but who is now sadly gone. And they came out with a pamphlet, very powerful pamphlet called Global Warming in an Unequal World, a case of environmental colonialism. So they were still thinking about colonialism, empire, inequality. And that's why they made a very important intervention, which kind of had an effect, which is that they insisted that carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions be counted on a per capita basis. And of course, when you do that, you realize that it's the developed nations who bear the historical responsibility for this. But also, but the argument was that, well, so the implicit argument was that we need to pollute the atmosphere to have growth. You guys have taken far more than your share of the pollution, right? So now we should have the right to pollute, and you should pay us money and give us technology whereby our pollution would not have the same kind of bad effect as your pollution did. And you know, that was a reasonable argument if you had the power to enforce it. And also the argument was made, initially China was with India in backing this argument, but soon China became the biggest emitter. And the Pacific Islands peeled off the coalition. So the third world stance that India had for quite a few years actually in this question was hard to sustain. I mean, Jairam Ramesh, when he was the environment minister, used to point this out sometimes and get into arguments with his own climate negotiators like Chandrasekhar Dasgupta and all those people, you remember. But this question, very important question, still remains as a legacy of all these interventions, which comes under the topic that we often discuss called climate justice. And that raises the question of who are the nations and the people retrospectively guilty, and who are the nation and peoples prospectively guilty, right? Because it was the prospectively guilty nations that were charging the retrospectively guilty nations with their guilt. And anyway, that's a complicated argument about justice there. There's an argument there, but I'm leaving it to one side. But the question was, but again, so the first time this climate question came under the pressure of someone's awareness of the history of empires and colonialism. I mean, even though neither Sunita Agarwal, Narayan or Anil Agarwal were historians, you begin to see that they were opposing what they saw as the one worldism of the West by the question of what divides us. And that was a mood that actually was in sync with what we're doing in the humanities, because see, in the humanities over the funny thing about humanities is that if you look at the history of humanities before the war, Second World War, humanities basically belonged to people with aristocratic temperament. The last humanities scholar, people say, was the gentleman English scholar, independent scholar, who had money, who could go to the library and produce scholarship. Because subjects like prosody, rhetoric, grammar, logic, uh, these were topics that Machiavelli's prince learned, right? And if you only have to look back at what the British did in India, they ruled us by teaching Milton and Shakespeare, because humanities basically served as somebody's claim to cultural superiority, and therefore as somebody's claim to the right to rule. But what happened, humanities undergoes a sea change after the Second World War, particularly because there are new classes entering the academic system. In the West, particularly if you use the English expression, the Red Brick University in England, right? Sussex. And I mean, these are places where working class kids come. That's why you have the emergence of cultural studies in Birmingham, right? That Stuart Hall was part of. So what happened in 1988 when actually James Hansen is talking about climate change, Homi Bhabha and Stuart Hall and Isaac Julian come together to have the first conference on Franz Fanon, the fact of blackness. So there's a kind of divergence, the climate guys are talking about what's happening to the planet and, what's happening to all of us, that we are in it together. And the people opposed to this oneness are talking about differentiated responsibility. And people in the humanities are not even aware that there's a problem called global warming. So the literature on globalization, one might say, was broadly blind to the planetary environmental questions. I mean, they actually, even if you read Rob Nixon's book, which is a later book in both the postcolonial field on environment, which is really again taking the environment question back, sort of routed through all the human differences, right? And but the assumption even in postcolonialism was that the problem was with distribution. Growth was needed, inclusive growth, as Manmohan Singh used to say, growth with justice, but growth was needed, right? So it was not a critique of growth as such. So if you go back again to the growth story, I mean, go back to the 50s, Soviet Union and United States gave us visions of modernization, competing visions of modernization. These were the decades when things like fridge, television, dishwashers became household gadgets. Some of the gadgets were like dishwasher and the fridge were sold and advertised as equipments that would liberate women from drudgery of household labor, right? They were sold as emancipatory gadgets. So in many forms, the theme of development and the theme of freedom, I mean, you didn't have to wait for Amartya Sen to write development is freedom. Well, he has a particular meaning of it, but they were connected from the beginning, and actually with a lot of justice, because I know if you didn't have a lot of energy available to us, you would still have forced labor. I mean, you wouldn't be able to build any big structures without forced labor. So the very fact that we can build skyscrapers, huge big human monuments without forced labor is because we have more energy at our disposal. And the source for most of this cheap and plentiful energy came from fossil fuels, right? And this was actually, so what happens with the coming of fossil fuels is that you enter what I often called, in my head, the Steve Pinker stage of human history. Steve Pinker Steven Pinker at Harvard is always writing books about how human society is constantly improving. And there's a joke that Kant makes in Conflict of Faculties, where he says somebody comes to his doctor and says, and this was a doctor who always says, but you're improving. And the man says, yes, but I'm dying of slow improvement. So Steven Pinker's books are, I mean, he's right. Humans in the last 200 years have lived, in spite of mass poverty and everything, humans have lived so well as they've never lived. I mean, if you look at human history, even up to the 18th century, even in Europe and places, hunger was an everyday companion of human beings. except for the very rich, very aristocratic people, right? So if you look at the 20th century, it's a huge expansion of economy, population. People begin to live longer once we have antibiotics, once you have, public health measures. So the world population, see, it took, if Homo sapiens are 300,000 years old, then it took us, when we were kind of 1.6 billion in 1900. At the end of the 20th century, we were 6 billion. Today we're approaching 8, right? So when you look at these population rises, I have several figures, but I won't bore you with them. So you begin to see what now Earth system scientists call the Great Acceleration, and that's where I want to show you some graphs if I can. I hope I'm technologically so inept. So I had several rehearsals of this with my student assistant. I hope this works. There are so many Indian jokes about failing right on the performance, right? Well, the rehearsals go fine. So I hope that doesn't happen. So let me share screen and see if I can show you quickly these graphs. Okay, I think I can. So these are, most people who work on climate change will know these graphs, but you can see them. These are Will Stephan, who is the system scientist, and others. There's the historian John McNeil is part of this. But if you look at the figures for population, real GDP, primary energy use, that is before this generation, sorry, water use, you will see that it all actually grows exponentially from the vertical line is 1950. And that's why it's called a period of great acceleration, taking from Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation. They've used the phrase great acceleration. And if you actually could resolve these graphs and come to 1970 and 80s, you will find that the rise becomes even steeper. Because that's when China modernizes, Reagan and people were deregulating the American economies. So this is, the orange graphs are really about what humans are doing. And these blue ones are roughly about how the planet responds to what the humans are doing. So basically, the planet produces more carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, what happens to the ozone, that is the depletion of the ozone layer, surface temperature. So again, you see there's a kind of a correlation with that vertical line, 1950. So I'll just stop sharing. Okay, so these are called the Great Acceleration graphs, and which made that these are also years when we lived really well. So sometimes, when people say, what is global warming, what's climate change? And I say, it's like sort of, your grandfather and the entire village lived it up in a 5-star hotel. And they left thinking that they paid the bill. So they didn't think they were going to damage their grandchildren or great-grandchildren. And somehow, some of the bill was unpaid. And suddenly the great-grandchildren are sort of given the bill, say, okay, now pay for what your grandparents did. So sometimes people talk about climate change being a backloaded problem. So you're always dealing with the carbon emissions of the past, not with the carbons you're emitting now. So that's kind of the other side of the Steve Pinker story. And now tell me, how much time do I have? I'm probably getting to the... Can you quickly tell me how much time I have? Let me check on my timer.
As much time as you can give, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, because we don't want you to stop.
Okay. No. So, okay, then I'll quickly, just, so this kind of, so the other thing, apart from medicine and stuff, which is also part of this story, is technology. So basically, this one of the funny things about technology here is that technology is a very double-barrel thing here, because on the one hand, say, take the drilling technology. You can't extract oil without developing drilling technology. But even for the climate science, to prove that the warming is really happening now, you have to compare current air with old air. Where do you find old air? You find old air in ancient air trapped in ice bubbles, ice cores. Where will you get ice cores? How will you get ice cores? You drill them in the poles, right? Out of the snow and the ice there. And what drilling technology do you use? You use the same technology that the oil companies are using. So one of the interesting things about climate science is that the same technology that is destroying the planet is also giving us the knowledge about the destruction. Some people, I think, in my humble estimation, mistakenly believe that we can use the same technology to save ourselves. So there's a lot of fixation talk about geoengineering and this and that. But I'm saying technology plays a key role, so much so that there's a geologist called Peter Haff who argues that there's something called the technosphere which exists on the planet. So the argument is that, like when we talk about the planet, we talk about, what do we talk about? We talk about the lithosphere, that is the rocky formation, right, over which soil exists. Then we talk about the biosphere, which includes all the living things, living beings, where life is. Then we talk about the atmosphere. Then we talk about the stratosphere, which is the ionic, right? And he says, but in this biosphere, there's a thing we should now separate and call the technosphere. And his argument is that the technosphere includes everything that connects us as human beings. All human beings are connected by not just the cell phone, but by container ships, by airplanes, by telephone, by all kinds of stuff, right? So he puts it all together, and his argument is that humans would not be able to sustain a population of 7.5 billion or 8 billion or 9 billion or 10 billion without the help of technology, whether it comes in the form of artificial fertilizers, genetic modification of food, or in terms of this telephony that we have. And his calculations claim that if you took the technosphere out, human population would crash to about 11 million from 7.5 billion. So he therefore argues that technology has become the precondition for our biology. And so he even has a mystical sentence, or sort of Luhmann kind of sentence for a geologist, where he says, we should think of the humans as the sentient aspect of the technosphere, because the technosphere has its own momentum. Once you put it there, you need to keep feeding it. And this technosphere is very important. The other important thing is that humans have become the most important geomorphological agent on the planet. So, which means that we shape the planet's landscapes. We move more earth around than all the rivers of the world taken together. And so that, the earth moving equipments you think about are ubiquitous. I grew up in Calcutta seeing, and you must have, all of us, the older ones amongst us, would have seen these bamboo scaffoldings. And in Calcutta, it's usually women who would take baskets of concrete or bricks or something up the steps of the scaffolding to give to the male laborers who were actually working with it. But now they've all been replaced by steel scaffoldings and these huge earth-moving machines of different shapes and sizes, but all yellow-colored. And wherever I go in the world, they have the same color, yellow. And we actually also have reshaped the continental sea shelf through our trawlers and things. And the argument is, and now of course people have made a connection between the technosphere, deforestation, and the COVID pandemic, the zoonotic diseases that are coming. So it's clear that our growth, which is technically fueled and is dependent on technology, is producing a form of flourishing for us. So when you look at the number of humans whom you could consider consumers, there's a Hoover Institution report on this. So we had the first 1 billion human beings who were consumers like people who bought fridge and cars and all these gadget air conditioners and things we're talking about. So the first 1 billion consumer number was reached around 1986. It took 21 years to get to the second billion. It took 9 years to get to the third billion. and they're thinking that it'll take 7 years to get to the fourth. So there's even great acceleration there. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the number of the kind of people who made up the consumers of the world, in around 2000, is mostly from white countries, mostly from so-called developed nations, Japan included. Now the bulk of it are from China, India, upcoming African nations. So we actually are the majority of the consumer classes, which are fast developing. So so there's a very interesting argument that is made by this Israeli historian Harari in the book on not Homo Deus, the one before that, on Homo sapiens, right? Sapiens, a history. And it's an argument that's been made by other people. So the argument is, and this is an argument about the difference between technological change and evolutionary change. Technological change happens much, much faster than evolutionary changes. So creatures who change only through evolution find it very hard to keep up with creatures who can produce very fast technological changes. So if you go back to a few million years, that is before there were Homo sapiens, but when there was the genus Homo was around, right? Not Homo sapiens. So kind of proto-humans. And if you look at the tools they produced, their tools were mostly to do with the breaking of bones. And why did these hominins have to break bones? Harari says because they were quite sort of down the food chain. And they had to wait for more aggressive animals like lions or hyenas to clean off the flesh of a dead animal's body. And then they would come in and break the bones to get to the marrow. So when, in evolutionary terms, when lions became majestic hunters, their prey, like the deer, became fast runners.
Did we just lose the audio, or is it just me?
No, we did. I think
we did. Yeah.
I think we are seeing a
Maybe
frozen screen.
Yeah, we can wait. Probably he'll try to reconnect. Shraddha, Zahra, maybe one of you, do you want to ping him and alert him, because he may not know, and he may just keep speaking. So I think it would be a good idea to just ping him.
He will rejoin.
Yeah.
While we wait for Professor Chakrabarty, please feel free to send us your questions. Thank you so much. And thanks for your patience. We'll be back in a second.
Zahra, Shraddha, have you pinged him? Have you told him about it? Right. Shraddha, do you want to stop the YouTube, or we want to stay live, and maybe we can freeze the